All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to Carrie and Corey for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm really excited to be part of this program, and thank you to those in the audience for attending. I am going to start sharing my screen because there's too many good images of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn not to share them with you. So just let's see. There we go. All right. So Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was born in Concord, New Hampshire in 1890, and she died in Moscow in 1964. She spent more time on picket lines than she did in libraries, but she loved to read. And she led such an active life, she really only read intensively during periods of enforced idleness. So for my talk to you tonight, I've tried to just kind of pull out a couple of moments where she did have time to read and just sort of try to contextualize that along with everything else that she was doing. So when she turned 14, an abscess from an infected tooth forced her to take a 6-month break from school, and she plowed through classic books. She read authors like Edward Bellamy, Henry Thoreau, and Henrik Ibsen, and she emerged from this period as a feminist and a socialist. At age 30, the stress of the Red Scare brought on a mental and physical breakdown. As she convalesced in Oregon, she read the classics, focusing on history, science, and the Bible. And at age 65, when Flynn was imprisoned in Alderson Female Penitentiary for being a leader of the American Communist Party, she read her way through the prison library, enjoying fiction by Thomas Mann, Henry James, and Virginia Woolf. But one of the documents that Flynn returned to the most over the course of her long life was the US Constitution, especially the First Amendment, which guaranteed the right to free speech. I shouldn't say guaranteed, I should say guarantees the right to free speech. And Flynn cared deeply about the First Amendment because she spent her entire life advocating dissenting ideas. And so to figure out how she became such a dedicated and tireless radical, I think we need to start with her childhood. Flynn was born in Concord, New Hampshire in 1890 to a radical Irish American family. Her father, Tom Flynn, grew up in Maine, and he went to work in a granite quarry with his father and brothers when he was just 10 years old. After seeing all of the men in his family die from lung disease, Tom decided to become an engineer. He enrolled at Dartmouth, but when Tom's older brother died, he had to leave school to help their mother. Tom acquired enough skill to become a map maker, but his work was unsteady. Flynn's mother, Annie Gurley, migrated to New England from Galway, Ireland as a teenager. She was the oldest of 13 children, and she was a highly skilled seamstress who worked to support her family. She was also a feminist. She saved her earnings to go hear lectures by two leading suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Annie taught her daughters, Elizabeth, Kathy, and Bina, to be self-reliant and self-supporting. These are Elizabeth's words about her mother. Her son, Tom, named after his father, seemed less directed and suffered from depression. When Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was 10, the family moved to the Bronx. Their first apartment was infested by mice, cockroaches, and rats, and they could barely afford heat, soap, or clothing. On cold winter days, Elizabeth recalled, the family would huddle in the kitchen and shut off the rest of the house. She and her siblings did their homework by the light of a kerosene lamp when the gas was shut off for non-payment. Their only real entertainment was reading. Every week, they walked across the bridge to borrow books from a public library on East 125th Street. In 1902, the family began attending meetings at their local socialist club. As Elizabeth later recalled, socialism was a great discovery, a hope, a purpose, a flame within me. Her father became something of a fanatic, dragging the family to long meetings. Elizabeth's brother and sisters fell asleep, but she was riveted. Elizabeth's mother, Annie, often wished that her husband, Tom, would go out and get a job rather than sitting at the kitchen table reading Karl Marx. Socialism has numerous definitions. Flynn understood it as an alternative to capitalism in which productive property and natural resources would be owned collectively and managed to benefit the public good rather than being owned by an individual or corporation and managed to make a profit. Flynn spent most of her life trying, in her own words, to persuade the majority of the American people that socialism would be a happier, more secure, and peaceful, more just and equitable system of society than capitalism is or can be. By the age of 16, Flynn was speaking on street corners around New York City. She advocated socialism and critiqued women's oppression under capitalism. Soapbox speakers were a feature of city life in those days. This was prior to the invention of radio, and people who had a message to get across climbed up on a soapbox on a street corner and simply held forth. Flynn's speeches often centered on working class women's low wages, their lack of birth control, and their double day of wage work and housework. She worked through her political goals through two organizations. The first, the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, from 1907 to 1916, and the second, the Communist Party, from 1937 until her death in 1964. Both groups advocated socialism, but they thought about it very differently. The Wobblies were strongly anti-state. They envisioned workers' cooperatives as the basis of a new society. They advocated direct action rather than participating in the political process. The communists, in contrast, were very pro-state. They looked to Soviet Russia and then the Soviet Union as an example of a socialist society. Despite these significant organizational differences, Flynn was one of many people who began their political lives in the IWW and then continued on as communists. Although, of course, there were many members of the IWW who did not want anything to do with the Communist Party. Flynn later described these two phases of her life as her first life and her second life. And because Carrie invited me to help contextualize the story told in Jess Walter's book, The Cold Millions, I'm going to focus more on Flynn's first life, although I will tell you a bit about her second life as well. Flynn joined the IWW in 1907. Despite being a star student and a champion debater at her Bronx high school, she dropped out and went on the road for the IWW. As an agitator for the Wobblies, Flynn became famous for leading free speech fights in the Pacific Northwest in 1909 and 1910, and for leading two major strikes of textile workers in the East, the first in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, and the second in Paterson, New Jersey in 1913. At this point in her life, Flynn's youth, beauty, and radical message brought her attention wherever she traveled. Out on the road, she met and fell in love with Jack Jones, a former miner and IWW organizer. As her friend Vincent St. John's remarked, Elizabeth fell in love with the West and the miners, and she married the first one she met. In September of 1909, Flynn led the first of about 25 free speech fights. This one started in Missoula, Montana. She was arrested in October for speaking without a permit, but quickly released. The IWW used the strategy of mass arrest as a means of civil disobedience, but men who were arrested often suffered from violent repercussions. In December of 1909, Flynn arrived in Spokane, Washington for her next fight, visibly pregnant. At the request of the strike leaders, she tried to stay out of the public eye by speaking only at the IWW hall and editing the IWW newspaper, but she and 6 other leaders were arrested on conspiracy charges. And here's how I describe her experience of arrest in my book, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Modern American Revolutionary. On a cold winter morning in 1909, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn woke up in a Spokane, Washington jail cell to the unwelcome feeling of a strange man's hand on her cheek. She sat up and told him she was not there to be insulted. He backed off, leaving Flynn her breakfast, weak coffee and stale bread. She had spent the night in jail after being arrested on conspiracy charges. Pregnant, she had been thrown into the single woman's cell with 2 prostitutes. Flynn's cellmates had tried to make her comfortable, sharing food and lending her a pillow. Having been arrested several times before, Flynn was relieved that she was not alone. At the mercy of men, you do not trust a moment, day or night, unable to defend yourself or call for help. Despite the company the women offered, the heavy door to the jail cell had opened and closed all night as the jailers brought the women downstairs to visit sweethearts. Flynn found the women and the jailers to be on terms of disgusting familiarity. Later that day, she was out on bail. Awaiting trial, she reflected, this all in the name of law and order. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? Charges against Flynn were ultimately dropped. In April of 1910, the city of Spokane agreed to allow outdoor speaking without a permit as long as the IWW stopped calling in outside agitators. When the battle ended, Elizabeth's husband expected her to move with him to Butte, Montana, where he could resume his work as a miner and she could be a conventional wife and mother. But she had no interest in this plan. As she later recalled, I wanted to speak and write, to travel, to meet people, to see places, to organize for the IWW. I saw no reason why I should give up my work for his. Flynn left Jones and went back to her family in New York City, where she gave birth to her son, Fred. Flynn's sister, Kathy, and mother, Annie, helped Flynn to raise her son. And here is a picture of the 3 of them shortly after Fred's birth. Elizabeth's experience of being a mother helped her to understand the particular challenges that female wage workers faced, and she brought this experience to bear in her organizing for the IWW for the famous Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which began in January of 1912 and lasted until March. The strike in Lawrence began when workers discovered that their wages had been cut in proportion to a new state labor law, reducing women's working hours from 56 to 54 a week. 25,000 men, women, and children participated in the strike, which included workers from more than 25 nationalities. Women made up the majority of the strikers, and Flynn held special meetings for them. She focused on the challenges they faced, having to earn and also being responsible for their families. Many had to work right up until they gave birth. They had to live in crowded and expensive housing, and they could not afford to buy the fine wool cloth that they produced. As part of her work in Lawrence, Flynn managed the Children's Crusade, and this is an image from that sort of organization of children to take them out of Lawrence to cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Barre, Vermont, so that their mothers could participate actively in the strike and so that the children could be safe, because the strike got very violent. The impoverished state of the children when they reached cities like New York drew a lot of attention from the media. And here they are, here is a parade of these children after they reached Grand Central Station in New York. This also helped build support for the strikers who succeeded in rolling back the wage cut and raising their wages. Equally as important, the workers claimed a right to be treated with dignity. Lawrence, Massachusetts also became the location where Flynn met Carlo Tresca, a dashing Italian anarchist who became her partner until 1925. In 1913, Flynn and Tresca worked together on a strike of waiters and culinary workers in New York City. Newspapers remarked on Flynn's leadership. You can see here, they called her the real power behind the strike, and also that workers were demanding an end to tipping in favor of higher weekly wages and an 8-hour day. Flynn and other strike leaders, including Tresca, used creative techniques during this strike. Picket lines of cooks wearing top hats and carrying canes encircled the city's most elegant hotels. Well-dressed sympathizers went out for dinner, then blew their whistles at an appointed time, signaling the cooks and waiters to walk out. Flynn gathered testimony from restaurant workers on common but unappetizing practices, such as reusing napkins and serving soup that had been simmering for weeks. Despite its sinister name, her pamphlet, Sabotage, said more about these kinds of techniques than it did about violence. At a time when labor conflicts often did become violent, Flynn did not rule out self-defense, but she saw violence in strikes as counterproductive. From February to July of 1913, Flynn helped to lead an equally impassioned, if less successful, strike of 25,000 silk workers in Paterson, New Jersey. And here is an image of her addressing strikers. And one of the things about Flynn that I think is almost maybe hard to convey or understand now is what a dynamic public speaker she was, and just what a prominent role public speakers played in American life at that time. So people who heard her speak, kind of never forgot it. And here you can see her addressing the crowd, and you can just kind of get a sense from this photograph, how magnetic she was when she was holding forth on a platform. So this strike included 25,000 silk workers. And here the issue was the doubling of the number of looms an individual worker tended from 2 to 4. In Paterson, New Jersey, Flynn, the IWW had a difficult time. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, there was a lot of violence against the strikers. This was also the case in Paterson, but on top of that, there was a lot of prosecution of the strikers. So a lot of legal action was brought against the strikers, and this made it very difficult for people like Flynn to organize, which of course was the point. Flynn was charged with inciting violence and prevented from speaking. Whereas the IWW had managed to build an incredible sense of solidarity in Lawrence, in Paterson, New Jersey, there were stronger divisions between workers, between skilled and unskilled workers. And also there were many smaller firms, so it was more complicated to come to a settlement. And the strike dragged on for months. The human drama in Paterson and the free speech fight that broke out around it gained the attention of radicals in Greenwich Village who tried to figure out creative ways to support the strikers. The journalist Jack Reed staged a huge pageant at Madison Square Garden that featured actual strikers, as well as leaders like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Big Bill Haywood. The strike collapsed in July when skilled workers settled with employers. So ultimately, I think Flynn felt that the pageant at Madison Square Garden had been an artistic success, but hadn't actually done much to help the strike. Joe Hill, and here's an image of Flynn around 1915. I would say this was the high point of her work for the IWW. Joe Hill wrote the song "The Rebel Girl" for Elizabeth Gurley Flynn after she visited him in jail in Salt Lake City, where he was charged with murder on shaky evidence. Flynn launched a campaign to try to secure his freedom, but it was not successful. And Hill was executed shortly after he wrote the song in her honor, making him one of many martyrs to the radical cause of one big union. And also kind of making Flynn known, still known, I think, as the rebel girl. In the long run, far more violence was directed against members of the IWW than was perpetrated by them. And this violence came from many sources: employers, the police, vigilantes, state militia. But the most destructive violence of all came from the federal government. And although I, as a historian of the United States, had some general knowledge about the Red Scares that followed World War I and World War II, learning how Flynn experienced these events, I think, was probably the most surprising part of my research. I really hadn't realized just how extensive these Red Scares were. When the United States entered the Great War, later known as World War I, in April of 1917, membership in the IWW surged from about 40,000 to 100,000, with many new members in industries such as mining that served the war effort, and also industries such as timber and longshoremen. In September of 1917, Flynn was one of 168 leaders of the IWW indicted by the federal government for seditious conspiracy, a crime that ranked next to treason. Flynn managed to get her case severed from the group indictment, but approximately 1,500 radicals were imprisoned for the duration of the war, and thousands of foreign-born workers were detained. Most were eventually released, but hundreds were deported. And one of the things that I did not know until I did my research is that during World War I, Ellis Island effectively became a jail to hold radicals who they were considering deporting. So having managed to escape prison herself, Flynn worked day and night to free people who had been convicted on charges relating to activities or affiliations judged threatening to national security. So at this point, she left the IWW and she formed an organization called the Workers' Defense Union. The crimes that these people were charged with, and this is a picture, this is all men in this picture, but women were charged as well. They range from refusing to enroll in the military to leading strikes in war industries, belonging to the IWW, or participating in organizations that supported the Bolshevik Revolution, which broke out in November of 1917. Flynn tried to limit the scope of the deportations to secure decent treatment for those who were still in federal detention. She took the ferry, she lived in New York City, and so she took the ferry out to Ellis Island almost every week to check on the health of detainees and to bring them things they needed, including clothing, food, soap, medicine. Many of them, had to leave very hastily. And I think probably these suitcases in the picture were probably, this was typical that people really didn't have much with them when they were rounded up. Flynn herself barely survived the Red Scare, and in 1926, she suffered, after years of work, she suffered a breakdown and moved to Portland and withdrew from politics for a decade. So this is not her during the breakdown. This is her during the 1920s, when she was really active in labor defense and started the Workers' Defense Union, which was an organization that was associated with the start of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. But she did become very depressed. Her personal life got complicated. And so she kind of fled for 10 years and went out to Oregon, where she lived with the physician, Marie Acquis. And if anybody wants to know more about that, I can talk about that in the Q&A. In 1937, Flynn came back to New York and kind of resumed her political life. And I think it's interesting, the terms, her first life was the Wobblies, her second life was the Communists. And for Flynn, basically her life was her political activism. So here she is in the 1930s in Union Square after she decided to join the Communist Party. And Flynn was enthusiastic about the Communist Party, in part because she saw them as supporting workers' rights to organize, being associated with the New Deal coalition, extending the fight for an 8-hour day. So she was very on board with what the New Deal was doing, and she liked the fact that the Communist Party was supporting it as part of the Popular Front. During World War II, Flynn, like other American communists, supported an all-out battle against Hitler. She used women's massive entry into the paid labor force to push for feminist objectives. So again, she resumed her, kind of went back on the lecture circuit, traveled all over the country, spoke in favor of equal pay for equal work, expansion of federally sponsored daycare, an end to all forms of sex and race discrimination, and the provision of affordable housing. Flynn saw no conflict between her communism and her feminism, explaining in one of her many speeches, "It's traditional with the Communist Party to fight for the rights of women." When the war ended in 1945, so too did the United States alliance with the Soviet Union. And as the two superpowers battled to shape the new world order, communists like Flynn became internal enemies. And this is a picture of her probably around the time that she came back to New York, I would say, a little bit later when she's a Communist Party activist. In 1948, a dozen leaders of the Communist Party were charged with conspiring to advocate the overthrow of the United States government through force and violence. Flynn herself was indicted a few years later on the same charges. The Red Scares that followed World War I and World War II both set new limits on American liberty in the interests of national security. Flynn found the post-World War II Red Scare to be far more hysterical and fear-laden than its predecessor, the World War I Red Scare, when the IWW was the national bugaboo. I'm quoting her here. Flynn had managed to assemble a strong, united front in defense of political prisoners during World War I and its aftermath. But by the late 1940s, communists had become isolated, in large part due to their own policies. But during the Cold War, anyone who was a communist or even associated with a communist could be blacklisted, kicked out of school, or lose their job. As Flynn's case wound her way through the appeals process, she found an escape in writing her autobiography. And her autobiography, which was called The Rebel Girl, focused exclusively on her first life, ending prior to her self-imposed exile in Oregon in 1927 and making no reference to communism. By focusing on her earlier years, Flynn granted herself a respite from the present when the prospects for American radicalism looked bleak indeed. In January of 1955, at the age of 65, Flynn began serving a 28-month sentence at Alderson Female Penitentiary in West Virginia for conspiring to advocate the overthrow of the US government through force and violence. And here is an image of the penitentiary. From prison, and this is, one of the interesting things for a biographer is when she was in prison, it actually generated all of this historical evidence because her letters were all censored. And so the FBI or the net, there's records of her letters because they were all censored. And so in a sense, this is like a boon for a researcher, but at the same time, the circumstances, under which she wrote them are obviously, were bad. And also she wrote the letters knowing that they were going to be censored. So you sort of have to, read through them carefully. From prison, Flynn wrote to her sister, Kathy, "One's own life, especially if it is a life with a purpose, a social purpose like mine, is precious to one. And at my time of life, I can't spare too much time." Prison cut Flynn off from her family, her friends, and her work. At night, she locked herself into her cell and read books borrowed from the prison library. She spent her days in the basement of the prison hospital, mending sheets and making pillows. Claudia Jones, who in this picture, I guess you would say she's to the left in the picture, to Flynn's right, she was a good friend. Claudia Jones, who served 9 months in prison with Flynn, remarked, "There sits this outstanding daughter of the American working class, who at 65 years of age has so much more to contribute to the nation's progress." Flynn was denied any reading material related to her crime, and she could only exchange letters with 5 correspondents approved by the FBI. As I mentioned, her mail was censored, and the letters that she received became the property of the federal government, which destroyed them. So I only have, all historians have, are her outgoing letters, none that were coming in. One bright spot came when her sister Kathy brought page proofs of her memoir, but Flynn was not allowed to correct them because that too was considered to be sort of political activity. Despite this hardship, Flynn not only survived prison, she lived to write a book about it. And I'm going to just tell you, this one has a really wacky cover. So she wrote a story about it, refusing to reform or repent. She explained in the book, she vowed to reduce. So she had gained a lot of weight, and she basically treated prison as an opportunity to finally make good on that diet plan that she'd had for a long time. She lost 75 pounds, her blood pressure improved, and she was suffering from really bad arthritis, and that was better too. She felt more energetic, and she was excited to get out of prison and buy a new wardrobe. By the time she was released from prison, however, the Communist Party was a shadow of its former self, decimated by government repression and by the fundamental problem of trying to follow the twists and turns of policies emanating from Moscow. But Flynn refused to renege on the party. In 1960, at age 70, she took her first trip to the Soviet Union. And she got there and she was really given the red carpet treatment, which I think was just, a huge, it was almost the opposite of what she had experienced in the United States. So at home, Flynn was classified as being a criminal because she was a communist. But when she finally made it to the Soviet Union, she discovered that she was a heroine. Her biography, her autobiography, The Rebel Girl, had been translated and issued all over the Eastern Bloc. And she was very well treated. So she was sort of thrilled by that. But at the same time, I think she must have known that she was only seeing a very narrow slice of life in the Soviet Union. So here is a postcard that she sent to her nephew, Peter Martin, who was her sister Bina's son. And this is at the Walter Reuther Library. So this is really cool. I think this is a picture of the subway, which is a little bit, if you live in New York City, as they did, was pretty impressive. So here is her picture. A postcard. So while she remained highly attuned to the inequities that women suffered under capitalism, in her later years, Flynn reproduced Soviet propaganda about women's equality, announcing in an article for the Communist Press that the Soviet system had abolished the domination of women by men and guaranteed to women an independent existence as a human being, a worker, a citizen, a wife, and a mother. So, I mean, I kind of take this with a grain of salt. Privately, Flynn admitted that traditional ideas about women's subservience to men died hard, but publicly, she insisted that conditions were far better for Soviet women than they were for American women. And I think that, you know, she just kind of couldn't give up on the dream of communism, especially after she had served 2 years in prison for it. And she kind of clung on to it as being an alternative to capitalism, even though, you know, it was obviously problematic in many ways. So throughout her life, Flynn remained an idealist, and she ultimately died in the Soviet Union. And in writing her biography, I came to see her idealism as both a strength and a liability. I mean, she was incredibly energetic and, you know, never gave up on her ideal of a socialist America. But I think, you know, during her first life, it's easier to be sympathetic with that part of it than her second life when she became a communist. And I think that's part of the reason that she's not better known. I think it's hard for people to know what to do with these sort of two parts of her life and how to bring them together. Despite tremendous repression for nearly 60 years, Flynn stuck to the causes that she believed in, and she inspired tens and thousands of workers to organize to improve their conditions. And she advocated a class and race conscious form of feminism. So I think that is another thing that makes her interesting and relevant. I think usually when we think about feminists, probably the people that would come, I mean, Flynn lived such a long life, but during her first life, the people that would come to mind would probably be suffragists. And she didn't really have anything in common with them because she actually didn't even want to vote when she was a wobbly. And during her second life, I would say she didn't really live to see, you know, second wave feminism. But she really thought the whole time that you couldn't really understand women's oppression apart from class oppression or racial oppression. And I think that intersectionality was something that she actually did develop within her experience of the Communist Party. So in that way, I think there was probably growth in terms of her ideas of feminism during her second life. But Flynn's loyalty could be a liability. She refused to give up on the dream of the Soviet socialist utopia, even after abundant evidence that it had failed. Despite these faults, I think that she deserves to be recognized for her key role on the left in the 20th century United States, and to be admired for her fundamental faith in ordinary people to make their lives better and improve the world. All right, thank you. All right, so that is the end of my formal presentation. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Vapnek, for such a fascinating presentation. Now is the time, everybody. If you have a question, enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And there are a couple questions now. So Carrie and I will go through and start reading those.
Great.
All right, well, I'll start with the first one. During your research for the book, what are one or two things that you discovered about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn that surprised you?
Oh, wow. It's
I
hard
know,
to say,
tough one to start it off.
one or two. One thing I thought that was interesting is when she was in prison, this kind of surprised me. She wrote a lot about missing the company of men, which I thought was interesting. So she was in an all, of course, prisons, tend to be single sex. And she wrote about missing the company of men. And I just thought that was interesting because her relationships with men were often kind of difficult. Carlo Tresca, her relationship with him had been, really kind of a disappointment. And so I thought that was interesting. So she sort of wrote to somebody, once I get out of prison, like, I can't wait to like go out to dinner with some men and like have a martini and a steak, which I thought was funny. Another thing that I discovered about her, and this I didn't know from her own, papers, but I read a memoir that of a younger woman in the Communist Party. And she said that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, I guess she was really known for her salty language. Apparently, like, she was this incredible orator, but when she was speaking to friends, like, her language was very salty. So I wish I had a sample of like what she said, but
Thank you.
lost to history.
All right, so one question here is there any film or audio recordings of her speaking?
That is a great question. I'm trying to think if I ever found something. I might have found some audio, but like really not much. And I wonder now, I feel like every time I go back, there's more material that's digitized. So it's possible that there is something and I just like don't know about it. But I really don't. I wish I had a film of her speaking. I mean, I don't know if there is one and I just haven't seen it. I know that there was a film that was made, I think, of the Patterson strike. So it's possible, she was in that somehow, but it's not something that, was easily accessible when I was doing my research. So really what I was left with was, photographs and descriptions. And I just sort of had to imagine it.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
So what led, I'll refer to you, Dr. Vapnek, to study Elizabeth Gurley Flynn so extensively?
That is a great question. I actually came across Flynn when I was doing my research for my dissertation. I did my PhD at Columbia University, and my dissertation was called The Politics of Women's Work. And it was all about women's labor activism. And that became my first book, which is called Breadwinners, Working Women, and Economic Independence. And so I had come across Flynn when I was doing this research, but I kind of didn't know what to do with her because she really did not fit in with the other working class women I was looking at. So these were women in the late 19th and early 20th century. They tended to be women who were employed in industry, and they organized with other women, and they often made alliances with kind of more socially conscious, more well-to-do women. So it was I guess it was like a sort of an early form of labor feminism. But Flynn and a lot of them were suffragists. So the 5th chapter of my book was all about working class women's fight for the vote. And so Flynn just didn't fit into any of this. She never really organized. She wasn't really interested in single sex organization. She kind of always worked with men, which is maybe part of the reason why she missed seeing men when she was in prison. She always worked amongst men. And she wasn't interested in the first part of her life in state action. So she didn't fit in that way either. She actually didn't even vote until the 1930s when she became a communist. So I found this great line in her diary. She voted for Fiorello LaGuardia as mayor of New York, I think in 1937. And so she wrote, "I voted, ceased to be a wobbly." So just the fact that she had voted to her was like, you know, she was no longer a wobbly. So part of it was just that she didn't fit in. And then I also just wanted to understand, I guess, you know, this first life and the second life, like how was it that she had done all of these kind of heroic things in the 1910s, and then like how did that fit with her deciding to become a communist? So I think I was kind of I was trying to sort of piece it together and just understand, you know, how she saw continuity between these two things, even if it was, you know, difficult for somebody like in the 21st century to understand. So sorry, that might be a slightly long-winded response.
This is great. Thank you.
Okay, someone asked, what research are you working on now?
Oh, thank you for asking. I am working on a book that is about the history of infant feeding. So kind of taking things in a different direction, but I think building on my interest in gender and class and political activism, I'm looking at the history of infant feeding as a form of labor. So I'm looking at it as a labor historian, thinking about breastfeeding as well as bottle feeding from the mid 19th century up through the present. So it is a very long and sweeping story, but I'm finding really interesting stuff. And I recently had an article actually published in the Journal of American History that is about the history of wet nursing in the 19th century.
Great, thank you. So I don't think you touched on this in your talk, but I believe it touches on this a little bit in the book. Where did Flynn get the idea that communism supported feminism?
Yeah, that's a really, you know, that is a really good, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that in part, there just were not a lot of other alternatives for her, in that the American left, which had been, you know, kind of, there were like all of these different left-wing movements in the 1910s that kind of supported each other. I would say, including feminism and the labor movement, were pretty like simpatico, even if they were not identical. And with the Red Scare, just a lot of those alliances kind of frayed. But I think Flynn actually looked to some older women who she knew who had joined the Communist Party. There were people like Ella Bloor, who was a prominent organizer, who joined the Communist Party probably before Flynn did, like, you know, maybe in the late teens or the 1920s. So it's interesting because Flynn kind of went all in once she joined the Communist Party, but she joined fairly late. She didn't join until the 1930s, even though there had been a Communist Party in the United States from shortly, you know, after the Russian Revolution. But communism really just kind of split the left. So it split the old Socialist Party, and the communists kind of broke off. They were very factionalized for a long time. So she kind of kept her distance for a while. But then eventually, I think she decided to join, in part because she saw that women were really active in the party, women like Ella Bloor. She also had a lot of admiration for a woman from California named Anita Whitney, who became a communist, who had been a suffragist, and for Marie Acquis, who ultimately she had a relationship with, actually, when she moved out to Oregon. She had been an advocate for free speech. So I think that all of these, it was kind of, I think part of it was just the people she knew. And then also kind of seeing, like, trying to figure out the way forward for the left after the Red Scare. I think she also just thought the Communist Party in the 1930s were like the people that were doing things and they were going to be successful. She hoped they were going to be successful. And I would say that, there were a lot of prominent women kind of at the local level. The national leadership remained very dominated by men, but there were a lot of women in the 1930s who were participating really as part of the Popular Front. So, in the 1930s was like a less kind of rigid ideological phase for communism. And I think that's part of why it appealed to her, because she thought it was going to be effective. And because I think the kind of organizing they were doing, like things that women were doing in terms of organizing around like consumer interests and stuff like that, I think she thought that that was kind of a promising way of organizing women. And then it was interesting to me that it was really during World War II, when she was a communist, that was sort of her most outspoken period in favor of women's rights. So she also, I think, used her position within the Communist Party to advocate for women's rights. So that was kind of interesting to me. I mean, I think the Communist Party wanted her because she was this representative of American radicalism, and she could help them make an argument, that they were a grassroots movement. So I think in a sense, I would say they were using her for that, but I think she was also using her position within the party really to advocate for things that she believed in, especially feminism.
All right. Let's see, the questions are coming in now. How did her time in Oregon influence her later life choices, such as communism?
That's a really good question. So her time in Oregon, it's really is really hard to piece together, because she got depressed, she had a heart attack, she had like a mental breakdown and a physical breakdown. She ended up staying with Marie Acquis, who was a feminist physician in Oregon and also an out lesbian. She ended up staying with her for 10 years. And during that period, there was like very little documentation about Flynn's life. So I just have a couple of letters that she wrote to people. And when she did write, she described herself as depressed. And I think she was kind of not really sure what to do with herself. But she spent a lot of that time reading and, kind of just like resting and recuperating, I would say. So it was really kind of a pause, although certainly there was a radical labor movement in Oregon that she could have probably gotten involved in if she wanted to, but she really just, she kind of laid low during that 10-year period, and then reemerged as a communist. And so, exactly how that happened is a little bit hard to know. She has this kind of dramatic story. There was a dramatic sort of family story of her sort of being rescued from the home of Marie Acquis, and it was like she couldn't get away from her. But it's honestly really, it's really hard to know. And I think that part of her life is also, it's really colored by just the difficulty in kind of the later hostility to queerness that characterized the Communist Party and that characterized the Cold War. So it's kind of the retrospective, depictions of that relationship are difficult to understand. Although Marie Acquis was really a force in her own right, and there's a great book about her by a guy named Michael Hellquist. If anybody wants to read more about Marie Acquis, she's worth a read as well.
Thank you.
All right. In casual conversation, communism and socialism are often used interchangeably. Could you enlighten and
Yeah.
explain the differences?
Definitely in 30 seconds. No. Yeah, no, I think that that's a really great question. And that was something that I was trying to understand, as I was writing this book, which is that there really was there was no communism before there was no communism with a capital C before the Russian Revolution. So the way that we use communism would be associated with the Russian Revolution. Prior to that, there was a kind of American form of socialism that was pretty popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so there were American socialists. And American socialists, they believed, in this idea of collective ownership. They thought that basically capitalism had taken over the country and that the people needed to kind of take it back. And they thought that America could kind of become socialist just by electing socialist candidates. So in a lot of places, there were a lot of socialist candidates that were elected, like in cities like Milwaukee, there were a lot of socialists. So there were just kind of parts of the country, and some of that was coming from German immigrants who tended to be socialist, or, many of them were socialists. So socialism was I guess I would say it was a big tent, it was kind of like a diverse movement. Basically anybody who believed, in this idea that we needed to find an alternative to capitalism and that people needed to kind of organize cooperatively, that profit making was not a good way to organize the world. So socialism in that sense, I think, it's like a very broad-based movement. Communism was much more, as I'm using it historically, it was really like aligned with the Soviet Union. And it's confusing because the communists, of course, were socialists or claimed to be socialists, but we might think of that as a kind of state-sponsored socialism that I would say pretty quickly degenerated into a kind of dictatorship. So it didn't really end up and there were many American socialists, who didn't become communists, or, some number who just said, this is not true socialism, right? This is more of a dictatorship, especially when Stalin came into power. But then there were others who thought like, well, this is an example of a country that is, socialist, and like we need to support it. And that was what was behind the communism. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Laura.
Sure.
Corey, before you ask the next one, it is 7:30. Laura, we don't want to take up too much of your time, but there are several questions.
Oh yeah, we can keep going. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to sort of try to, there are several questions about her son. And would you be able to talk a little more about her son and if he went into political activism? Someone else just said, do you have any information on what happened to her son?
I know that's really left out of my, trying to get the whole book into like 30 minutes. Poor Fred got left out. But yes, and actually, see if I can hold up a picture. Her son, so as I mentioned, due to Flynn's career, she basically had to kind of turn the raising of her son over to her mother and her sisters. And I think it's interesting actually that they called him Fred Flynn, so they didn't call him Fred Jones. So in a sense, Flynn's feminism, extended to the naming of her son. And unfortunately, he died at a fairly young age. Maybe he was like 30 or something. he got cancer and he died when he was quite young. So he had kind of gone into, I swear I have a picture of him. Anyways, he had, I would say their relationship was kind of difficult, to be honest. Like, I think her work took her away from the family a lot. She felt like she probably wasn't there maybe as much as she wanted to be. He was certainly well taken care of. But I think, when she left and went to Oregon, that kind of strained the relationship. He stayed back in New York. And actually, then when she moved back in 1936 or 37, she moved back to New York. She kind of resumed her relationship with her son, and she was really happy about that. So actually, like, as adult, when he became an adult, she felt like she got to know him more. And she wrote this great column that talked about, going to a baseball game with him and like drinking a beer with him and getting to know him. But tragically, pretty shortly after that happened, he got lung cancer and he passed away really at a young age. So that was the end of the relationship. And I think she felt, very sad that it was sort of like, just as she had kind of repaired the relationship somewhat, he died pretty shortly after that.
Right. Let's see, Mark asks, what happened to the IWW?
World War One. I mean, I think, if you Google IWW, you can see that it's still, it went on, and it still exists today. It still exists in some form. But really, it was almost killed by the Red Scare. So I think, World War One, really federal prosecution against the Wobblies really knocked it out. So that indictment of all the leaders, the prosecution of people, the deportations, like the IWW just couldn't survive that. And so it really was a victim of the Red Scare, I would say. Now, I think some of the ideas that the IWW advocated, kind of lived on in subsequent social movements. This idea that of organizing all workers together, which was how the IWW organized. They didn't want to have any divisions between skilled or unskilled workers. They thought that, all workers should be organized together. Some of those ideas were taken up by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, which really kind of, expanded labor organizing. So that idea, I think some of their ideas got taken up, by subsequent organizations. You could even see some of them as getting taken up by groups like Occupy Wall Street. That would be probably a movement that, the IWW would recognize.
Thank you.
If they were still around, they would be happy to see things like that. But this idea, it's a really different strain. It's sort of the opposite of communism, which was, so kind of state centered, and the IWW basically saw states as being coercive, essentially. But I think that one reason that Flynn was ultimately attracted to the Communist Party was she felt like when the IWW was attacked, in a sense, because it was kind of decentralized, it was really hard for them to mount an effective defense. So I think that was something she thought, well, that didn't work. Like, let's try a different way of organizing. That was also, I think, part of the appeal of the Communist Party, was that they seemed better organized.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Could you comment on any conflicts that Flynn may have had with male-dominated labor unions?
That's a good question. Let me think. It's interesting. She somehow kind of managed to do her thing. Like, she worked, when she was in the IWW, she worked really closely with this guy named Big Bill Haywood. And they would, kind of say, okay, you go talk to the women, I'll talk to the men. And they seemed happy with that. But ultimately, I think she really did conflict with Haywood over the response to the political repression. I think Flynn ended up feeling like maybe her opinions were not valued that much by the leadership. I think they kind of liked her as like a figurehead, but when it came to making decisions, she was often left outside of the room for sure. And so that doesn't express it. It's not like I don't find her saying it, but I can kind of see it happening. I can see how within the IWW, they love this image of the rebel girl, and it made them seem modern and exciting and inclusive. But when it came to actually making policy, I don't think they were really interested in what she had to say. So I think that would be an example of her dealing with sexism in the labor movement. The other place that I really saw that was just because she lived so long, was just watching her age and looking at the ways that she was depicted as an older woman versus the ways that older labor leaders were depicted. And so when she kind of becomes active again in her second life, you have journalists saying things like, well, it's really it's easy to see that she was very pretty when she was young, but now she's kind of like she looks like a grandmother. I think at that point she was 50. So it was like about my age. It's like, grandmother, wait a second.
So
But
oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah. But so I think that part, that part of it was interesting too, was just the ways in which as a woman, it was sort of more challenging for her to age in public than it was for a male labor leader.
Thank you. So there are just a few more. I'm going to actually try and combine two here.
Okay, great. I'm excited. There are so many questions. That's great.
Did she divorce her husband after Fred was born, her son? And can you also tell us a little bit more about her self-induced isolation, for example, why she thought it was necessary? And then somebody also asked if there's any more information about her depression and what caused it.
Okay, yeah, great questions. So she did eventually divorce her husband. And actually, she doesn't say this in her autobiography, but I think that, as far as I can tell, I think that she got married. I think it was kind of a shotgun marriage. I think she got pregnant and then decided she had to marry him because her family, as radical as they were in some ways, they would not have been happy with her being an unmarried mother. And also, I don't think the labor movement would have been happy with it either at the time. This was the early 1900s, so that was really not acceptable. So her relationship with her husband, she writes about it in her autobiography, The Rebel Girl. It just I don't know that there was that much to it to begin with, and I think it just kind of frayed pretty quickly. She does also talk in that book about having a miscarriage, and so she talks a little bit more about her personal life there, and I think that was really hard on her. So their relationship, my sense is that it was not something that was destined to be like a long-term relationship, and she didn't seem like she was like, she seemed to have moved on pretty quickly. I don't know how he felt about it. Now, her relationship with Carlo Tresca, on the other hand, much more complicated, because she, and I couldn't even get into this in 30 minutes, but she, like I said, met him during the Lawrence strike, stayed together with him until 1926. And actually, the thing that led to their breakup is that she discovered that he was having an affair with her sister. So I don't know if the person who asked the question knew this already. But when she discovered that, that was really devastating news to her. And that was, I think, something that definitely played into her breakdown and kind of just her need to leave New York and leave her family and just kind of like, you know, try to like put all of that behind her and go out to Oregon. Although interestingly, she did end up repairing her relationship with her sister Bina, who was also living out west. So they did kind of make amends and they did end up repairing their relationship. But she never repaired her relationship with Tresca. And so when she came back to New York in the 30s, she would kind of see him occasionally and just, you know, wanted nothing to do with him. But yeah, he really broke her heart.
Okay, somebody wanted to know if she ever mentioned Medicare or Social Security.
That's a great question. She didn't mention those things. I'm trying to think. I don't think she mentioned those things, but she certainly would have been in favor of them, in that she was in favor during her, you know, later years, certainly of a robust social safety net. So I think she would have seen, you know, healthcare as probably a good thing, and certainly Social Security as a good thing. So I think she probably, you know, she would have appreciated those things and probably saw those as policies that had improved the lives of American workers. I mean, part of the reason that, you know, you had an organization like the IWW in the early 1900s was just workers were just so exploited, and there were really almost no laws protecting them. You know, there were no safety regulations. There was barely like workers' compensation. There was no Social Security. It's almost hard to imagine, you know, kind of how difficult and dangerous workers' lives were. And that's part of the reason why they kind of, some of them gravitated toward these radical groups like the IWW.
Right, I'm up next here. So I'm going to try and combine two questions again. What were Flynn's thoughts on Khrushchev in comparison to Stalin? And then we'll add a second one in there. Could you elaborate on your comment on Flynn trying to keep up with Moscow?
Okay, that's a great question. So I think she saw Khrushchev as an improvement. She, I think, met him probably when she went to Russia. This was part of the surprise, I think, of being like going there and discovering she was a VIP. But she saw Khrushchev as being very, you know, I think that made her hopeful, you know. So she saw him as certainly better than Stalin. And, you know, one of the things that I really was trying to reason through as I was writing the book is like, how did she rationalize all of the terrible things that came out about Stalin? But I realized part of it is that a lot of this actually came out when she was in prison. So a lot of the, you know, sort of like the discussion of the atrocities that he had committed, that happened when she was in jail for being a communist. And so she kind of said like, how, and she did say in a letter, like, how could this have been going on? Like, we didn't have any idea this was happening. So I think that, you know, it definitely like disappointed and upset her. But at that point, I think it was just sort of too late for her to do anything else. So she just kind of like stuck with it. But, you know, it's one of these things where, right, as the biographer, you would kind of want to say, you know, maybe it's time to go. but you know, that was not her choice.
All right, well, there's just one question left on here, and I think I know the answer, but they're asking if you consulted with Jess Walter at all on her life when he wrote The Cold Millions.
No, but I was very happy to see my book is actually in the bibliography, which is really cool. Yeah, I think my book was informative, which is really nice. But no, I haven't consulted with them personally, but hopefully my book was helpful and the books are complimentary.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Vapnek, for sharing some insight into Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's life and the important work that she did for women's equality and also workers' empowerment. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Yes, the one thing I'd like to share with the audience is we do have the copy of her book, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Modern American Revolutionary, at our library. Dr. Vapnek, yay! We're checked out though, I will tell you that, but we'll be returned soon. Also wanted to let you know that she is the author of another title called Breadwinners, Working Women and Economic Independence Between the years 1865 and 1920, as well as many articles exploring the intersections between gender, race, class, and political activism. And she also shared that she is writing a new book. So we look forward to seeing that come out. Wanted to let you know that we will share a link to her new book about her book, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, in a social media post in the next few days. So before we end, I just would like to share a little bit more about some Waukesha Reads programs that we have coming up. There's still time to register for the Munchies and a Movie on Sunday, October 16th. This event will be held at the Marcus Majestic Cinema, and we will be showing the movie On the Waterfront, featuring Marlon Brando and Carl Madden. So be sure to register for this program online. And then the special end of the month visit from author Jess Walter. This is an after hours event at the library featuring Jess, and we hope that you will join us for this event. We'll feature refreshments and an opportunity to hear him talk about this year's Waukesha Reads book. Corey, you wanted to also share something?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that this is our 16th annual Waukesha Reads this year, and we're really proud to be an NEA Big Read Library this year. So thank you to the National Endowment for the Arts for the financial support. And I also want to thank our other sponsors this year, the Friends of Waukesha Public Library, the We Energies Foundation, Generac, and the Waukesha Rotary Club Charitable Fund. We appreciate it. We couldn't do it without you. And we also want to thank all of our community partners who have donated their time and their spaces to help make all of this possible. So thank you so much. And please visit waukeshareads.org for more information on upcoming programs. And be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So thank you again, Dr. Vapnek, for joining us tonight. And I think that's it. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
do just want to add one thing before I get cut off. I know we want to be sure to thank the Organization of American Historians for sharing Laura with us, Dr. Vapnek, and so didn't want to forget to add that.
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.